Hi, everyone. Great to be here. Thank you, Blockchain for Europe, for organizing this summit. And good to see you, Fred. Good to see you again.
Thank you, Inbar.
So for everyone who's tuning in online and in the room, we're going to have a nice fireside chat about sustainability, blockchain, but also this is a regulatory event at its heart. So I'd love to pick your brain a little bit about what kind of conversations you have with regulators. What is the most important thing that is the main message you want them to understand when you have these conversations and confrontations?
Yeah, I think this is sort of cutting into the core of what's happening at the moment. So, initially blockchain simply delivered on its promise. And now we're seeing sort of a period where blockchain is coming back again, and the regulators has upgraded their knowledge quite dramatically, which is, great to see. But that knowledge has really been upgraded on what we think about as a generation 1 or generation 2 blockchains. And with the third generation blockchains, such as Polkadot, Algorand, Cardano, and others, you have multiple use cases which the regulator has not been thinking too much about. And very often you end up speaking with the capital markets regulator or the banking regulator or the Securities Commission and those kind of people. They're now asking really good questions. So they're no longer sort of just looking at, the token qualifications and kind of trying to figure out, is it a payment token? What features does it have? Does it, is it asset backed? And can we sort of, do some learnings from other jurisdictions? But they're also asking questions around critical infrastructure. So if we should build a bank, like somebody spoke about on a panel earlier today, if we should build a bank on blockchain. A bank is a very defined concept. It's a protected institution. It's supervised and regulated. There is something called critical infrastructure, and banks is a part of the critical infrastructure in many aspects. So they're asking about operational resilience. So a year ago, I had no discussions around how to do a disaster recovery on a public permissionless blockchain. Now I'm sitting in front of computer scientists, engineers who are saying, well, hold on a second, this actually is a really good operating model, and I think you're onto something, but can you tell me about disaster recovery? How do you actually monitor the network in real time if you have, as Cardano, 3,100 validators online? How do you actually do that? What is the tools? Can you put that into like a technology audit? And this is like a complete twist of what we had before. Secondly, the regulators really sort of, and specifically the policymakers, they now recognize this huge transition that's happened from Ethereum, going from proof of work to proof of stake. So I think a couple of years back, we were always speaking about this regulatory event and what would that bring? And they're now starting to talk very specifically around not just, the actual utility token, if it is a utility token, but they're also speaking about the incentive mechanisms, the corporate governance and the governance actions, but also is there banking activity happening or investment contracts underlying as a part of the infrastructure layer of a layer 1. So the conversations has definitely gotten more technical, they've gotten more deeper, and it's gotten more enjoyable, to be honest, because you're really facing off with people who's done their homework.
Right. I guess on one hand, we're seeing the impact of FTX and regulators looking to avoid that kind of thing happening again. And on the other hand, the technicality of the conversations has increased as the education moves forward and people are starting to understand the technology a bit better. And for Cardano specifically, I know that there's been a bit of a difficulty, as in June in the SEC, the Security and Exchange Commission's filings against Binance and Coinbase in these two separate lawsuits. Cardano was among, or ADA more specifically, were among the tokens that were listed as securities. So I was wondering, what kind of impact did that have on Cardano, maybe on the morale? Of course, the price hasn't been able to recover since then, but we won't get into that. But if there's been any impact across the sea from there?
No, actually there's been like zero impact. So basically, I think this was telegraphed, into the market already. The market was definitely expecting this. None of the pioneering entities of Cardano has been approached by any of the agencies from the US side. And this is only, it's basically an action directly against the exchange and the exchange model. And I think you have to be sort of very clear about that. So what we've basically done on our end is we just sort of, been a bit more vocal in terms of what are we actually doing to clarify what is Cardano and what is Cardano not. Because what was quite clear in those both case filings against those two exchanges was that the understanding, or at least the understanding they put on paper around Cardano was maybe not as deep as you could have expected by somebody who's been around since nearly inception and is one of the oldest altcoins out there. So what we've done is we actually just launched our regulatory tool. So it's like a RegTech tool on Cardano. And what it basically does is explains, and it's built for regulators and policymakers and lawyers and big four companies to explain how Cardano actually works. So if you imagine that you open the trunk of your engine room and you look down on the engine, it's not very many people who actually understands every little bolt and node and what kind of liquid goes where and so on. So what we've done is we spoke to a set of regulators, specifically the FCA and the MIS, and we got some really good ideas about the user experience they would like to have. And then we basically made that public now, and that's available for everybody to have a look at. And it's specifically you're really zooming in on the staking life cycle, because that's one of the large discussions at the moment. Is there slashing? Is there a lock-in period? Is it liquid? Is the ownership change? So really like imagine flowcharts. And the other part is that it's looking at the governance. So what kind of governance actions has been taken in the past, and how is that documented, and that the process has been followed. And I just basically came back from the parliament here, where I was explaining that to one of the policymakers, and he got completely excited because it really, without you having to be a computer engineer, you can actually see what's happening. And you don't have to rely on my words or my slides or my YouTube, and you don't need to read the code. You can basically verify that for the first time. So in many ways, it brings trust back into blockchain, which we sort of lost a little bit in maybe the last 12 months.
Right. Really interesting to me to hear that these are the kinds of conversations that you're having, in the European Parliament, so close to here. But maybe to move on a little bit towards the sustainability aspect. Before we get too deep into it, I think it's good to get a base understanding of what sustainability means and what it means in context of blockchain and the kinds of projects which are feasible.
Yeah, so you're hitting me with all the good questions today. This really has a double-edged meaning. So specifically here in Brussels, and specifically around boardrooms, there's been a big focus around one aspect of sustainability, which has really been about electricity consumption on specifically Bitcoin and Ethereum before they did that change. And here, obviously, Cardano is a complete different architecture. It is a proof of stake architecture, and it uses up 1 to 1 million times less than Bitcoin, but it's a different security mechanism, and it's trying to solve the problem in a different way. So yes, we had definitely some discussions around that on board level, also with some regulators, and there is going to some initiatives around, basically labeling different blockchains and so on, and that's been a part of it. But I think what's even more important is the other part of sustainability, which is that most blockchains has either a pool of money set aside for bootstrapping the blockchain to economic sustainability, or they have the opportunity to print more money to ensure there's economic sustainability and the incentives of a public permissionless or public infrastructure. And I think that kind of sustainability is questions we are finally getting now. And when I say finally getting, is because I think that's very relevant. I just had a meeting, as I alluded to before, and one of the questions he asked was, if the European Parliament or if a critical infrastructure starts using this, how do you ensure that Cardano also exists in the next 10 years? And then you actually come down exactly to that level, which is the economic sustainability or the escape velocity of a blockchain. And this is very different than a centralized funded, I sell products and I get a revenue, and for that revenue I can increase my products, compared to something which you de facto nearly are giving away for free, and you require basically that people leave more on the table than they take.
Right. And yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned this environmental impact that's been a big focus in the European Union. Of course, there was that moment in MiCA that everyone was afraid that there would be a proof of work ban across the block, which, we don't know what that would have actually looked like. And again, there would be this kind of grading system. There's talk of that, of different tokens according to their environmental impact. And it's also important in MiCA to highlight the environmental or carbon footprint of each token in the white paper. So for ADA, what grade would the EU give Cardano's token? And of course, this is interesting because it's also a proof of stake token, and that's been an active choice.
I mean, we don't know the rating system yet, right? But
only speculation.
Yeah, I mean, everybody speaks about blockchain, and nobody speaks about the same thing. And every architecture has some trade-offs. And I mean, the currently what I'm looking at, if you want to look at across comparable architectures, will be graded extremely well. I mean, like extremely well.
Why is that?
Well, basically because the proof of contribution, as we call it, is not electricity or compute power, but it's built on game theory. So it's not about how much electricity or your ability to do cooling power or how much, this, incredible complicated, puzzle is to solve. No, this is about how you vote and how you show trust. So the proof of contribution is built on completely different parameters than what you otherwise have. Now, where we would probably be hitting out a little bit bad, Cardano, is that we are too decentralized. So we are basically over-decentralized. So if you look at it, what would be sort of sufficiently decentralized from a computing perspective, it would be around 500, 600 stake pool operators or validators. And we have about 3,110 live at this given state. So you could sort of argue that we are sort of over-consuming, or we have too many validators out there. We're sort of making it too secure. And that's because we don't control who is a validator. We don't say, hey, I like you today, you can be a validator. And I don't like you because you live somewhere else. And that many blockchains actually do that. You have to sort of, go into a process and speak to their board, or you have to sort of, get, approval for being that. And we basically say everywhere, wherever you are around the world, you should have equal access to technology. And that also means that if you, even though you would know that there will not be enough economic incentive for you to do this work, you should still have the chance to make that choice. Because it still gives you an opportunity to bring knowledge back to your community, to add resources to the city-state you live in, to, educate yourself, to contribute, and not, money is not everything. So I think in that aspect, we're probably a little bit higher. And then you have sort of the centralized blockchains. We had some on stage earlier today, right? And they're sort of, extremely permissioned, right? There is 5 validators and that's it. And we control them, they're KYC'd, AML'd and so on. And that's very close to a centralized database. And if you kind of think about, compute and consumption of data, a centralized database will win on electricity consumption every single day. But it opens up some attack vectors, which is not very sustainable. If you then suddenly have to have, hundreds of thousands of, investigations when something goes wrong, right? So there's no really perfect solution, but my hypothesis is that, Cardano and ADA will be graded extremely well. So that really looks like that.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what this grading system will actually look like, what kind of elements will be taken into consideration, because if you look only at carbon footprint, of course, that gives a very skewed image of what exactly the entire project is worthwhile of. So it will be interesting to see what kind of criteria make the cut. There are so many different projects about sustainability when it comes to Cardano. Maybe could you just give a very brief overlook over what is the most important projects when it comes to developing sustainable development goals and the kind of microfinancing or different kinds of projects that you're dealing with?
Yeah, I think in general, there was a dream that blockchain would enable us to bank the unbanked, enable us to create a more equitable ecosystem where also the people who don't have access to technology could get that. And obviously also about, transparency, and transparency very often brings accountability. And I think, I saw Manmeet also here in the room earlier, which was one of the core contributors to Cardano very early on and so on, and big shout out to him. Cardano has always been around how do we change social systems and how do we change financial systems for the future. And I think one of the reasons why there is such a big focus on sustainability projects and, sustainable development goals and so on Cardano is because it attracted a lot of people who are not just about, information asymmetry and how do I get rich because I know how to do, I run a pool better than somebody else, or I do farming a little bit better, right? But it's really been around, can we solve some of the world's largest problems? And there's a whole range of resources going into that, which is not sort of directed around funding, but very much directed around brain power. So we have sort of really large sort of associations who's formed themselves based on use cases, whether that's in West Africa, where we have Empower, which is a very powerful organization who's looking into farming and agriculture, but also how they use supply chain tracking of some of this produce to get into other countries. In Eastern Africa, we have micro-lending, micro-financing, really thinking about digital identifiers. So it's not all the way up to KYC and AML, but it's sufficient that we can sit up here in Europe and basically see how people pay back on their micro loan. And by that, we can pool that into a larger amount into a smart contract and lower the interest rate, from these, insane double-digit amounts, which they normally are getting on the ground because they don't have an identity. They don't have a tax record. They don't have a tax filing. They don't have anything other than they have to go and buy some oranges or some produce, and then they sell that, after they maybe squeezed it or done something with it, right? We have in Ethiopia a project around students and identity and certificates. And as many of you know, Ethiopia is a fantastic country in terms of cultural heritage, but from a governance perspective, it's really hard to kind of know what side you're on. But we do have a big belief in that if you have to be a displaced person or a refugee, it must be very good that you can prove that you are a nurse, or you can prove that you have a degree in something. Not just that you have the paper, but you have participated in all the trainings, and there's multiple oracles who is verified and validated. You were in the room, you did those kind of things. In this way, it becomes much easier for the rest of the world to absorb that kind of labor, instead of sort of looking at those countries and saying, oh, I don't accept their qualifications, I don't accept their paperwork. We have, things around carbon footprint. So as you probably know, we planted up to 1 million trees and put every single tree on the blockchain, including the regulatory information, but also the variable information. So the acidity of the earth, pictures of the tree crown and, those kind of things, because it means something with the carbon footprint. And we actually got accepted by one of the world's largest centralized carbon issuers that they accept that kind of standard or that kind of data, which basically means that there's a difference between where you have your trees in the forest, and you can verify that not the other guys don't have the same trees. Right. So this is there's a whole range of these kind of things. Also, we work together with United Nations Humanitarian Crisis Organization, not only to upgrade United Nations on blockchain, not only to find new ways of doing funding mechanisms and changing the governance that also small donors have a say in which direction it goes, but also ensuring that they start using blockchain. So there's a whole range of different initiatives across Cardano, and I just mentioned a few now.
Yeah, that's quite a few projects, and I know that the sustainability topic will also continue tomorrow, and there will be more of these kinds of discussions. Just a reminder for the audience, if you have any questions for Frederik, now is your moment, and I will try to get to them at the end of the session, which is already coming up soon. But for now, I have quite a blunt question to ask you. Who actually cares about sustainability on blockchain? This industry is so focused on finance, so focused on tech. Have you seen any challenge in getting these sustainability projects out and supported as much as the more financial aspects of the industry?
Yeah, I actually think that's a huge problem. So we spend a little bit of time to look at some of the data from some of the larger blockchains, and nothing against them, right? I mean, they've done amazingly well, right? But if you sort of look across the board from Ethereum to Avalanche to Stellar and so on, right? You see that there is really good initiatives, but they are dwindling. They're sort of like a drop in the ocean compared to the DeFi and the harvesting and the mining and all those kind of activities. So I unfortunately still think that, that there's too much money to be had around some of those models, and it's a little bit too hard to engage in these very tough problems around, traditional sustainability and sort of, blockchain for good. And that's also why the foundation has created this new educational system, where we really spend a lot of time to describe and really do these scripts. And we're giving that a way for other blockchains and also other universities So basically, they can put their own logo on it. They can, if there's a competing blockchain, that's fine. Just take our slides, take our material, and get it out there. Because the more people who actually know how to do something who changes the world to a better place, the better it is. But the economic incentives has definitely been too big to earn money or to sort of, benefit in these things. So we saw way too much development in that side compared to, let's say, a bit more the SDG side of blockchains. That's for sure.
I see. Someone told me today that Cardano is a bit of a mystery to them, so hopefully this helps to to unravel what's in there. Is there any questions for now in the audience for Fred? Because I have more questions. I just wanted to check. In the meantime, also wanted to talk about greenwashing, if that's something that comes up in the work that you do. I know that, if you look at the Cardano website, you don't immediately see sustainable or green or so on. But has your sustainability angle maybe brought any backlash in that respect?
Actually, that's a bit of a comms question, right? So we know for a fact, because there's a big group of people who's basically monitoring the energy consumption and also the silicon garbage footprint. So when you look about the CPUs, what kind of footprint does these rare metals have when the servers goes off and so on. So we know we have very good data points around Cardano. And I think what you're aiming at, why don't we say, hey, we're the green blockchain, and why don't we, get a certificate for some kind of an organization who goes in and verifies that? And we have on purpose not done that, because we're basically a scientific peer-reviewed blockchain. And the thing is that if you don't have the ability to go out to 3,110 stake pool operators and really truly go into the engine room and understand their setup, you will build that on very large assumptions. The second part is, it does feel like the whole world is saying we are greener than everybody else. And that sort of leads to a bad taste about greenwashing. So the way we've sort of looked at it is, okay, we have really good data points about, for instance, blockchain from Cambridge, Bitcoin from Cambridge University. They've done really, really good work there. And they also looked at the proof of work version of Ethereum, but they actually also looked at Cardano and other blockchains. So we do have the data points, but the question is, how good are they compared to how good they should be? And the second question is, are we comparing apples and apples? So if you look at sort of the European Parliament, do we actually know what is their electricity footprint? Do we know their carbon footprint? Do we know how much they're traveling? There's done some work or made some assumptions around those, but those assumptions are in very big boxes. So at the moment, what we do know quite closely due to the way proof of work works, we know proof of work very well. And then there is a big fat tail where it gets more and more iffy. How sure are you actually in your mathematical assumptions? And I think what's really good here is that we are now finally starting to get transparency. And with transparency, we can do action. With action, we can change things. But I think what we need to do now is also focus on other exponential technologies, but also sort of like where we live and where we go around, and try and get some good verifiable data points on it. So that's why we haven't posted something around that or made a cheap campaign around it. We might still do it someday, but at the moment, that's not on the agenda.
And what's the next big challenge for you at the moment when it comes to speaking with policymakers or pushing forward some sustainability agenda? Very quick, because we have a few minutes.
Yeah, I mean, you must imagine, right? So Ethereum has done an amazing job. And if Ethereum is this room, Cardano is 10 chairs in here. So because Ethereum is so big, also from a platform perspective, right? You don't start digging into, a level below Ethereum. You go to Ethereum and you start trying to figure out what that is. And then you might go one blockchain below where you might hit some of us. But actually the design principles and the use cases on Cardano or Polkadot or on Algorand and so on are significantly different than what Ethereum is made for. So I think one of the big use cases is we need to go from a place where we are technology agnostic to a place where we are technology specific towards the use case we are looking at. And the big majority of use cases will not be capital markets and finance only use cases in the future. It will be every industry we touch has a need for better data, for better collaboration, and less asymmetry, both in terms of regulatory oversight, but also in terms of how we collaborate and towards more growth or a better world, depending on where you're coming from.
On that note, thank you so much. Great to hear from you, and hope that the audience learned something as well. So on to the next panel, and thank you very much for listening.